Hello and good afternoon friends, welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, as you know that from time to time we introduce such subjects, such topics which are relevant for you, which are beneficial for you. So taking your considerations into account, today we would be talking on food hazards. We would be discussing on the threats to food as well as we would be highlighting on the types of food hazards. And for this discussion, we have with us within our studios Dr. Erim Rao. Dr. Erim Rao is the Associate Professor of Food Technology. She's from Department of Food Technology, Bhaskaracharya College of Applied Sciences, University of Delhi. Dear friends, I would like to tell you all that she has more than 20 years of experience, and I believe that her experience would definitely help us out in knowing the topic food hazards. So without wasting any time, I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Erim Rao.
Good afternoon. I'll be talking on food hazards as mentioned. Let's understand the importance of food. We know that food is a major determinant of health. It also provides us with nutrients. It actually is related to one's productivity, and that is why it is very essential that the food has to be wholesome. Now, when we make the use of the word wholesome, it implies two things. Number one, that food should give you good nutritive value, which means it should provide us with all the important nutrients for the normal functioning of the body, as well as it should be also free of contaminants, which is it should not have any toxic or noxious substances which are going to lead to disease. Also, we must make sure that the quality of the food has to be very good. It should be free of contaminants, adulterants, etc. So what are the causes of food hazards? We have various types, the most important being when we have microbial contamination of food, that is when you are following unhygienic conditions of preparation of food or storing the food, that is bacterial, fungal, insect contamination, etc. We also have man-made contamination which arises from human activities like discharging of effluent without treating it, or perhaps when we are using non-permitted food additives or misusing fertilizers, insecticides, pesticides, etc. We also have the use of unproven or new technologies for which you do not have the sanction of the law, and you have some examples of, let's say, GMO foods or genetically modified foods, and of course we are all aware of adulterants which are intentionally added to actually spoil the quality of food or perhaps earn a little profit. So let's begin with the word food hazard. What does that imply and how do we define that? A hazard is defined as a physical, chemical, biological agent in food or condition of the food with the potential to cause an adverse health effect. So the idea of consumption of food is just that it has to be absolutely wholesome, nutritious and safe. There are various kinds of hazards. So the various types of hazards are physical hazards, which means any physical material which gets into the food. For instance, sometimes when you're eating the food, you come across a small, or perhaps a straw or a plastic piece or a packaging material. That is a physical hazard. It could be things like as drastic as glass, wood, hair, stones, etc. And we know that it can cause an injury. Then you have chemical hazards on which I am going to elaborate in detail today, and this comes from two categories. One is man-made and one is what is naturally occurring in foods. One must be aware of the fungal contamination of peanuts. So these are nothing but aflatoxins which are formed once the food is perhaps harvested and stored in unhygienic conditions. You also have examples of unintentional additives or chemicals as we call them. For instance, use of colors which are not permitted under the law, or perhaps use of additives which are permitted but they exceed a limit in which they can be added to the food. You also have biological hazards which includes all the microorganisms such as bacteria, viruses, fungi, parasites, etc. Now, if you look at this flow chart, it talks about the places from which the food can get contaminated. So, if you begin with the crops, they can be contaminated by the human beings. So, the farmer can make use of fertilizers, either he can use them excessively or he can use substances which are not permitted under the law. He can misuse the use of pesticides or insecticides. Now, these residues are going to stay in the crop or in the food, and even after it has been primary processed or secondary processed and thereafter packaged and dispatched, it will still have the traces. So, one must follow what are called as good agricultural practices. Number 2, the animal feed per se. The livestock today is also being given foods or perhaps substances which should not be given to them. For instance, we have problems related to veterinary drug residues. I would be elaborating on that in detail as well. And of course, the human beings are responsible for polluting the environment, such as you have industry emissions, effluents, which are going to all find their way in the large water bodies, and we are going to also contaminate the flora and the fauna. So, the fish, marine food, etc. All these are going to find way in the processing while they are being stored and distributed, and through that it is going to be retailed and reach our houses or the consumer's table. So, if you look at the types of hazards, the physical hazards are those which can be actually physically seen. Now, the chemical hazards are a potent threat, and these are both natural as well as man-made. So, if you look at some of the examples of natural contaminants from the chemical side are, like you have mycotoxins, for example aflatoxin, which is seen in peanuts. Then you have certain kind of poisoning which is seen in the seafood or shellfish, etc. You also have certain mushrooms which are highly toxic because of the natural contaminants in them. You also have plant toxins. You have certain anti-nutritional factors which are present in pulses, legumes, seeds, etc. You also have certain kind of neurotic shellfish poisoning, etc., and these are going to be discussed later. Biological, we have already seen that you have, let's say, bacterial spores, you have Clostridium botulinum, you have types of them, you have Shigella, you have Salmonellosis which is present in raw egg, etc. And then the man-made one, which are supposed to be absolutely poisonous. So, use of chemical fertilizers, pesticides, fungicides, insecticides, or perhaps antibiotics or growth hormones. The point is that they have to be used for the production of the food, but you have to apply, or what is called as follow their maximum permissible limit. If you are misusing them, then naturally they are going to they have to have residual issues and they would entering the food chain. Then you have the polychlorinated biphenyls, and you also have the polychlorinated hydrocarbons. So, let us begin with what is contamination. Contaminants are chemicals which are not normal constituents of food and inadvertently find their way into food products through soil, water, animal feed or technological processing. Now, according to the Codex Alimentarius, they define food contaminants as any substance not intentionally added to food which is present in such food as a result of the production, such as in the operations carried out in crop husbandry, animal husbandry, veterinary medicine, manufacturing, processing, etc. Even after packing and storing the food, during transportation also there are chances of the food being contaminated. So, we begin with first the naturally occurring toxicants in the food, and in that we will first look into the toxic amino acids. Now, all of us consumes leguminous plants such as pulses and legumes, and we have to understand that some of them carry what are called as toxic amino acids, which are very harmful when ingested. Now, the name of this toxic amino acid which is harmful to us is called as BOAA, which stands for beta oxalyl amino alanine. This is present typically in Lathyrus sativus, which is called as kesri dal in Hindi. You also have a neurotoxin which is present in Vicia sativa, which is neurotoxin cyanoaline, and we also have mimosine in Leucona leucocephala. Now, if you consume these amino acids which are toxic, would lead to what is called as neurolatherism. Now, this is a disease in which your upper motor neurodegenerative diseases takes place, or paralysis in simple words takes place. This has been reported in the scientific literature way back in the 19th century. But the prevention is quite simple. One, genetic approach of cultivating low toxic legumes, and secondly, there is a developed process also by IARI, and they have begun with the detoxification by parboiling the seeds and then discarding the water. This kesari dal is soaked for about 20 minutes in hot water, and thereafter it is used for processing. The other toxic alkaloids which are present are actually all heterocyclic compounds which are occurring in the plants as their salts of common carboxylic acid, such as you have citric acid, lactic acid, oxalic acid, etc. Now, their amine character produces an alkaline solution in the water, and hence the origin of the name they are called as alkaloids. A number of foods which are commonly consumed have toxic alkaloids. Now, for instance, you have a weed which is capable of producing this particular toxic element, and examples are, for instance, you have pyrrolizidine group of alkaloids. Now, these are usually weeds which grow along with the crops, and when you harvest the crop, they come into the food, and when you process the food, they will enter the food chain. So, one of the examples which we see very often is that you have potatoes which are green looking sometimes. Now, these have been exposed to light, mechanical damage, or sometimes they have also had sprouting. Now, this means that there is an increase in the concentration of the toxic steroidal glycoalkaloid, which is commonly known as solanine. It is also called as cacomine. Now, this typically imparts a very bitter taste to the potatoes, and there have been reported cases of human poisoning due to their consumption. Also, when people who are suffering from arthritis consume these potatoes, they are bound to have aggravation in their symptoms. So, the symptoms would include mild poisoning, acute GI tract upset, vomiting, severe abdominal pain, etc. In more severe cases, there would be some neurological complications. It might even include drowsiness, apathy, confusion, weakness, vision disturbances, and sometimes even followed by unconsciousness, depending on the amount of the poison or the toxic alkaloid which has been consumed through the food. It also depends on the vulnerability of the population who is consuming it. So, for instance, it's been consumed by a young child, an elderly, a person who is ailing. All these symptoms are going to be far more grievous as compared to a person who is normal and healthy. Now, the good news are that the alkaloids are heat resistant, and that is why they cannot be destroyed on cooking, baking or frying. So, the best way, how do you prevent this? The moment we buy potatoes and see something which is like it's sprouting or has a green portion on it, it should not be consumed or it should not be bought. But in case if it has happened back at home, then in that case what you can do, actually cut off that portion of the green potato and then it can be processed. So, every care has to be taken that we have to minimize these food hazards, such as the ones which are commonly occurring in your potatoes, in your legumes, in your other seeds which are consumed. So, selection of your raw materials before processing is extremely important, and that is why we find that people take extra care in selecting foods which are absolutely fresh and healthy looking. Another example is that of dhatura seeds. Now, one had heard of this epidemic of dropsy a few years back, where the mustard oil had got contaminated by these Argemone mexicana, which is the name of dhatura seeds. Now, again, as I have said, this is a weed which grows along with the mustard, and that is why the chances of contamination are very high. Now, this toxic alkaloid can actually lead to some very disturbing signs and symptoms. It is characterized by gastrointestinal tract disturbances, edema, irregular fever, rashes, and sometimes if it remains untreated, it can also lead to death. So the poisoning can be also lethal for the human beings. We have another toxic alkaloid which is called as sanguinarine, and this is known to cause the disease. Now, amongst the cyanogenic glycosides, we have two other edible parts of the plant which are commonly consumed both by humans as well as animals. There are about 25 cyanogenic glycosides which are known to occur in approximately 2000 plant species. Some of the important ones I am going to discuss over here. For instance, we have linamarin, we have lotostrilin in cassava and lima beans. Now, if you look at durin, which is present in sorghum, if you look at taxiphyllin, this is present in bamboo shoots, and almonds, we are very well familiar with bitter almonds which have amygdalin. Now, this leads to acute cyanide intoxication, and reports have been put into the scientific literature that children who have consumed approximately 10 almonds which have got perhaps contamination with bitter apricot seeds or bitter almonds as we call them, they have had problems related to their hearing. The simple prevention is that you should not have, when it comes to cassava, you should not have cassava which has got damaged or it has a bitter taste, and in case of almonds also, bitter tasting almonds should be immediately spit and not consumed. Processing seems to detoxify the root and the millet as well. We also have trypsin inhibitors which are nothing but protein blockers. Now, several legumes and pulses seem to have protein inhibitors which are called as commonly trypsin inhibitors. The name comes as trypsin inhibitors because they look into the enzyme trypsin and block it. They also lead to growth retardation. It also leads to what is called as hypertrophy of pancreas, and essentially it also blocks an amino acid called as methionine, which means if these legumes and pulses not treated are given to human beings, especially to growing children, then it can lead to growth retardation also. Now, they are widely distributed, especially in red gram which is called as tur dal, Bengal gram which is called as chana dal in Hindi, cowpea. You also have soya bean, kesri dal, and some tubers such as potato and sweet potato. But the prevention is simple. They are heat labile and they can be easily destroyed upon cooking. So, all of us usually use high processing temperatures for cooking dals and legumes. We usually use pressure cookers. So, rest assured that all your protein inhibitors or trypsin inhibitors are destroyed before they have been consumed. A word of caution for soya bean consumers, that if you have soya bean flour in your atta, then you need to process the soya bean and thereafter you need to dehydrate it, then grind it or mill it and then consume it. If you are directly grinding soya bean as such and putting in your atta for fortification or perhaps having multi-nutrient or a multi-grain atta, then in that case you are consuming trypsin inhibitors. So, not just that protein which is coming from soya bean, but any other pulse or protein which you are consuming will not be picked up by the body or assimilated by the body. We are all aware of flatulence factors, or what we call it in simple words is indigestibility, and proteins are the most difficult to digest. We find that certain legumes such as Bengal gram, red gram, soya bean, lima beans, navy beans, black gram, green gram, etc. have large quantities of these. That means they have the ability to form gas, and that is carbon dioxide once digested and when they are in your small intestines. Now, it also depends on the type and the nature of the carbohydrate which is present in the different legumes, which is responsible for the difference seen in the various legumes. Prevention here is absolutely simple. You need to soak the pulse, especially overnight. For those which are called as legumes such as rajma, chickpea, red gram, etc., you normally soak it for longer period of time before you process it. So, this takes care of the flatulence factors. Now, another class of anti-nutritional factors which are present, or what we are calling as toxic elements which are present in pulses and legumes, are hemagglutinin. Now, this is essentially present in some of the plant seeds of the Leguminaceae family. Now, they contain a globulin type of protein which has the tendency to agglutinate red blood cells, and these are called as phytohemagglutinins. Now, what do they do is that they go and club together all the RBCs, which means persons who are ingesting foods which have been untreated or not subjected to heat processing because they are heat labile, then their RBC formation or perhaps they would lead to anemia. So, it is essential that we look into these anti-nutritional factors. The preventions are very simple. These are heat labile, that means it can be easily destroyed upon heating. The glutenins can be lost when it has been subjected to high temperatures, like when you cook pulses and legumes in pressure cooker, and the same is applicable to beans and horse gram as well. Now, some of the signs and symptoms include you have nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. At low levels, it leads to what is called as growth depression or growth retardation. You also have reduction in the food intake, that means loss of appetite, and in severe cases where the correction has not been incorporated or remedy has not been looked into, it can also lead to death. The prevention is simple again, as I said, that adequate heat processing of the legumes is recommended. Goitrogens are other class of anti-nutritional factors. Now, these are specifically present in plant foods which belong to the Cruciferae family, and they contain substances which are called as goitrogens, because what they do is they go and block the release of thyroxine by the thyroid gland. And what happens to the thyroid gland is, in turn, since it is not being able to produce the normal levels of thyroxine, it becomes enlarged in size. There is atrophy of the thyroid which leads to goiter. So, foods which have to be looked out for goitrogens are cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower and oil seeds such as rapeseed and canola. Prevention here again is very simple. Cooking destroys the enzyme which is responsible for the production of goitrogens in plants, and it is also lost through leaching in cooking water. So, when you wash the foods properly or soak them in water for some time, some amount of leaching of goitrogens take place. But heat processing is a short way of losing 100% of them, and that is why you would make sure that you would not be suffering from a disease called as goiter. Phytates are present in cereal grains and also in some lentils. Now, these phytates are also called as phytic acid. They are present in bound form with potassium, calcium and magnesium. Phytates have adverse effects on the availability of zinc, calcium or magnesium and iron because they form insoluble complexes with these minerals. Most of the Indian diets we know have high amounts of iron in them, but we find that usually Indians are deficient in iron and they suffer from anemia, because this dietary iron now combines with phytate or phytic acid and makes it unavailable for the pickup of the body or for the assimilation in the body. That is why we have to make sure that the food should be free of phytates or phytic acid. Prevention is very simple. You need to soak the grains in water for overnight. This is the most cost-effective way of leaching out the phytic acid. So, we have finished with the naturally occurring food contaminants in the plant kingdom. Now, I am going to look into some of the toxins which are present in the seafood and shellfish toxins. Now, there are a number of cases of food poisonings which come from seafoods and shellfish. The first one which I am going to look at is called as the Ciguetra poisoning. Now, this is because of a toxin which is produced by the algae which accumulates in the flesh of the fish, and these are usually called as histamines. The symptoms are characterized by pricking of the lips, tongue, throat, headache, severe pain in arms, legs, eyes. There is impairment of vision and also skin disorders. Now, the Ciguetra poisoning gets the name from the toxin which is called as ciguatic toxin, This is a polyether. This is the toxin which is identified and has thermoregulation effect as well as sensory, motor and muscular effect on the humans or the people who consume this particular shellfish. The other type is called as the diarrheic shellfish poisoning. This is caused by high molecular weight polyethers. You have neurotoxic shellfish poisoning which causes both gastrointestinal as well as neurological symptoms and occurs due to exposure to a group of polyethers called as brevetoxins. We have scombroid poisoning. This is caused due to the consumption of fish containing high levels of histamine, possibly a biogenic amine. The symptoms are characterized by metallic, sharp, peppery taste in the mouth, intense headache, dizziness, nausea, vomiting, facial swelling, rapid and weak pulse, itching of the skin, burning of the throat and difficulty in swallowing. Some of these symptoms are so drastic that sometimes it leads to what is called as asphyxia and even death, depending on the amount of food which is swallowed or which is consumed and the potency of the toxin which is consumed. Mycotoxin is another kind of food poisoning, and this is a neurotransmitter. It increases the contraction of smooth cardiac and skeletal muscles. Shellfish poisoning is caused by a group of toxins which are produced by planktonic algae. Symptoms: paralytic shellfish poisoning is characterized by neurological symptoms like in the previous one we mentioned of tingling, burning, numbness, drowsiness, etc. It is caused due to 20 toxins which are all derived from sac-toxin produced by din flagellates. Now, biogenic amines are nothing but biologically active compounds synthesized from amino acids. These are most commonly synthesized by spoilage microorganisms and are usually considered potentially toxic. The prototype of these amines is histamine, which immediately leads to allergic reaction. The symptoms include rash, nausea, diarrhea, flushing, sweating, headache. Severity of the symptoms can vary with individual sensitivity and the amount of histamine, which is a biogenic amine, ingested, but it can be severe for the elderly or immunocompromised persons. So far what we have looked into is all the naturally occurring chemical toxins in the food. So we looked into the plant kingdom, which included the vegetables, primarily some of the pulses and legumes, cereals, and also some oil seeds like mustard seeds, and also seafood and shellfish poisoning. We've talked about various types of toxins which are present in these shellfishes and seafoods, and which are very, very harmful to the mankind. Thank you. Good afternoon, friends. So we are going to talk about the food hazards part 2. We'll be looking into now the man-made contaminants. If you remember, we talked about chemical contaminants, and these were chemical hazards of two types, man-made and one of the natural origin. Now this time we're going to look into all the man-made contaminants. The first one is veterinary drug residues. All of us are familiar with drinking a glass of milk or consuming non-vegetarian foods. Have we ever wondered that how is the health of an animal maintained? Like humans, they are also susceptible to illnesses, and they do also have their highs and the lows. So veterinary drug residues automatically come to the rescue, and they are used to improve or maintain the health of the animals, regardless of whether these are intended for food products or otherwise. Now what happens is, when you give a veterinary drug to the animal, most of the drug is excreted out of the urine, feces or the air. But as we understand that chemical residues have the ability to be contracted in the system, and that is why we have traces of these residues which would remain in the system, or they would be fat soluble and they would stay in the animal tissue or the milk which you are consuming, and that is how indirectly they can cause harm or damage to the human beings. So the dangers which the consumers are exposed to with the veterinary drugs are antibiotics, you have steroid hormones, you have ectoparasiticides, we have antihelmintics, we also have antifungal agents. In very simple words, when you have an infection, the doctor recommends an antibiotic. So they would be provided with antibiotics. Steroid hormones are at times given to actually, it works like improving health, or perhaps if it's a milking animal, the steroid hormones are given to stimulate milk production. You have to also perhaps look after the infections which they have, and that is why the other medicines have to be also given. You have to give them antipesticides also. So we are going to take them one by one. The first one is antibiotics. What are they? Now they are basically antibacterial agents derived from living organism, but the term includes most closely related synthetic analogues. We are familiar with words like penicillin, tetracycline, aminoglycosides and macrolides, and the polymyxins, sulfides, sulfonamides, and are most frequently used or administered antibiotics in the veterinary medicine. So the major concern with these antibiotic residues in our foods are that those persons who regularly ingest food, or perhaps flesh of that food, or milk as we all consume, would lead to certain allergic reactions. So on a continuous basis, they are going to be affecting the humans who are going to consume them. Sometimes what happens is there is a build-up of the antibiotic residue, and that might lead to what is called as antibiotic resistant in the humans. For instance, if you are administered, let's say, a sulfa drug or penicillin as a life-saving drug for the individual, but if you've been already exposed to the antibiotic systematically by ingesting a flesh food which has been delivering penicillin in traces, the point would be that when you fall sick, the requirement for that penicillin as a life-saving drug would increase much more. You will have to be administered a higher dose of that antibiotic to perhaps deliver or to get rid of the infection. So this is what is where we are talking about, and sometimes the person can totally become resistant to the antibiotic, and that can be definitely life-threatening. Now if the food is milk, for instance, the residue will have the effect with even the starter cultures when you are preparing curds or when we are fermenting the foods. An important factor that determines the presence of antibiotic residues in milk has been the herd size. Now this is an interesting study, and it has been investigated that the number of animals a livestock rearer has is directly proportional to the level of antibiotic he would administer. Now if the farmer has only a single cow or a buffalo, he has nothing but he is completely dependent for sustainability on that animal, and that is why the chances would be that he would be misusing the veterinary drugs for maintaining the health of that particular animal. And that is why we find that the higher the number of animals, lower the observed use of antibiotics such as oxytetracycline, and their presence was noticed in the milk. And this is a study which was conducted in Hyderabad, and this has very convincing results that you can buy milk or perhaps the related foods from the livestock managers who have a big herd size. Now, steroid hormones is another category of veterinary drug residues. We have anabolic steroids like testosterone and its chemically related steroid hormones which have been used in the beef production. Now, diethylstilbestrol, which is also called as DST, has been actually banned because it has been proven as a carcinogen, and this study has been given by IARI. BST or bovine somatotropin is naturally present in animals and has been used for stimulation of growth and lactation in animals. Now, today what they are doing is they are using DNA recombinant technology for producing large quantities of BST, which is permitted under the law to be used as an antibiotic or a steroid hormone for increasing lactation or perhaps as a stimulant for growth. But if you are using DST, then it is a taboo, or it can perhaps tomorrow even lead to, God forbid, carcinomas. Pesticide residues is another big problem which is created by the mankind, because as we understand that pesticides are inevitable for the agriculture or for production of the food. But the problem arises when you start misusing them, or you use them in amounts which is not permitted under the law, which means it is going to have definitely some ill effect on the system of the person who consumes it. Now, first begin with the definition of a pesticide according to Federal Environmental Pesticide Act. It says any substance or mixture of substances introduced for preventing, destroying, repelling or mitigating any pest is called as pesticide. Now, pesticide word includes all of this. Pest would be insects, rodents, nematodes, fungi, weeds or any other form of plant or animal life. As I said that the use of pesticides in agriculture and health programs is inevitable. In general, pesticides like drugs are among the most carefully studied and evaluated chemicals. There are precise guidelines for their usage, for their production, for transportation as well as their storage. Now, despite all these guidelines, they are greatly misused, and that is simply out of ignorance at times, and at times of course it can be also indifference. There are various types of pesticides. So, we will begin with the categories. The first one is organochlorine pesticide. The second form are organophosphorus or carbamides, and then we have the pyrethrins and pyrethroids. Now, though pesticides are actually lethal, they are poisons, but they are beneficial to humankind when they are properly used, because it helps in production of crops or production of food per se. But if you misuse them or you use them indiscriminately, or when you do not use what are called as good agricultural practices, then the fallout could be hazardous. And when do they become a hazard? When they have been misused. Some of the pitfalls of misuse of pesticides are enzyme imbalance. You have skin and allergic reactions. We are too familiar with these words. Allergies have become a common occurrence to most people. You have delayed neurotoxicity. There are behavioral changes. You find a lot of children today cannot concentrate. There are obscene number of reasons for that, but one of them which has been pointed out is misuse of even food additives and food colors. Effect on reproductive system. There are reports of respiratory failure, and definitely there are effects on our immune system. There is immunocompromising of the system when indiscriminate use of pesticide has been reported. There is increase in cataract formation, loss of memory, and definitely carcinogenic changes. Repeated use may also result to what is called as resistance. Now, let us examine the pesticide residue problem. the magnitude of the pesticide residue in food, it varies with the type of the commodity, formulation used, climate, as well as temperature and humidity. It is interesting to understand that in India the residue levels are highest during the months of September and October, and they seem to be the least in the current months, that is March and April. Now, the study also which is conducted in India says that about 70 to 80% of all the food samples in the Indian markets have been found to contain pesticide residues 15 to 20% above the maximum permitted levels, or what we call it as MRL, that is maximum residue level. Specifically when it comes to milk and milk products, oils and fats, they appear to have a higher level of pesticide residues as compared to other commodities. A recent study which was conducted on the presence of organochlorine residues showed that even the maternal adipose tissue, the maternal blood and the cord blood of mothers or pregnant women has not been also spared. It shows that these residues are 7 to 10 times higher than in the occupationally exposed people or subjects, which is a cause of worry as well as concern. The first category which we need to highlight is polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which are also called as PAHs. Now, where do they come from? It is because of the combustion, pyrolysis, pyrosynthesis of organic matter, for example, burning of refuse, sewage sludge, etc. You also have noticed that the government of India has banned even burning the refuse from the garden, that is your dried leaves, etc. That is because it contributes to the PAHs, or the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. It is noticeable during the forest fires. It also is seen when you smoke tobacco or somebody is smoking, and we know that there is a public ban to smoking, coal combustion, etc. Now, what happens is these PAHs find way in the air, water, food, soil, aquatic organisms, oil, refined petroleum products, etc. That means they are almost omnipresent when we are indiscriminately burning the fuel, even when we are using coal as a source of perhaps energy, or for perhaps cooking as a cooking fuel. Now, what happens? Exposure to PAHs occurs principally by direct inhalation, that is tobacco smoke, I have said, polluted air, and possibly ingestion of contaminated food and water with tars and oils. And the place of the vendor where he is selling those fruits and vegetables or raw materials, where there is burning of the refuse, can also lead to indirect contamination. Now, this particular report is alarming, where you find that it leads to nothing less than gastric cancers. A number of studies have been documented that green leafy vegetables or green vegetables are contaminated with such compounds, but the good part is that you must wash them thoroughly before consumption. Even if you are using cold water for washing, it takes care of the external deposition of these compounds, make it slightly safe. There are other ways of also destroying it, such as you have the chemical and the biochemical oxidative mechanism. In this case, you have photooxidation, which is one of the most important pathways of quantitatively destroying it. That means it is susceptible to oxidation by ozone, peroxides and sulfur oxides. Microorganisms can metabolize PAHs too. Now, here is a table which is depicting some of the PAHs which we are not aware of and find their way in our foods. Now, if you can see this table, we have highlighted two, the most commonly consumed foods. If you look at bread toast and chapati, one of the examples of PAHs, which is benzanthracene, is 3695 micrograms per kg. So, even while consuming the chapati, which is cooked directly on the flame, leads to PAH formation. Bread toast gets benzopyrene, another kind of PAH which is present. So, toasting the bread too black or too brown is not a good idea. You also have crocine, which is another PAH which is formed when you toast the cereal or the bread at high temperatures. So, these are some of the small changes which we can bring about in our lifestyle. Now that we have learned that there are certain chemical hazards which nobody else but we ourselves are perhaps responsible for creating them. You have polyhalogenated biphenyls. Now, in this case you have polybrominated biphenyls and polychlorinated biphenyls. Now, the polychlorinated ones are formed from pesticides when you make lubricating and cutting oils, as dielectrics and transformers. They are present in flame retardants, in plasticizers, in paints, in the ink which is used in the photocopying machine, additives, and also some plastics. Now, the point is that they are very stable and resistant to chemical and biological breakdown. Polybrominated biphenyls are present typically in flame retardant chemicals. Their tolerance have been given at only 0.02 ppm in the body fat, and that is why all the dairy cows offered for slaughter had to be detected if they had the presence of the PPB. Now, this study was also reported in Michigan women, where the human milk or the breast milk was found to be contaminated by the PPB. The list of the organic pesticides includes, there are about nearly 300 of them. The ones which we are focusing are chlorinated hydrocarbons. So, you have class 1 which are oxygenated compounds, namely endosulfane and endrin. We have class 2 which are called as benzenoid non-oxygenated, which some of the examples are listed as BHC. You have DDT which is absolutely banned, and lindane. Class 3 are non-oxygenated compounds which includes aldrin. Now, chlorinated hydrocarbons, they have two typically important properties, and that is that chlorinated hydrocarbons are highly stable, which means they lead to persistence in the environment. In simple words, they are not biodegradable. They are able to solubilize in fat, and as a result they can deposit and accumulate in the fatty tissues, and that is why DDT is banned for usage as a pesticide. So, DDT is nothing but a technical compound that contains about 70% of the active ingredient DDT. Organochlorine pesticides undergo a variety of reactions which result in metabolites that are as toxic or even more toxic to mammals than the original compound. The organophosphorus compounds are better than the organochlorine ones, simply because they are soluble in water, they are more volatile, and that is why they lead to less persistence, or in simple words, they are biodegradable in nature. Examples of organophosphorus insecticides or pesticides are malathion, endothion, and parathion. These are subject to oxidation, hydrolysis, and demethylation, and that is why they cause less harm both to the humans as well as to the environment in which they are found. A lot of research has demonstrated that when you heat process the food, 90% of these pesticides can be removed, but before that even washing, blanching takes away a lot of pesticides, and this is pertaining only to organophosphorus, not organochlorine pesticides. Now, dioxin is a novel compound which students may not be very familiar with. These are a group of 75 compounds, of which the most toxic is 2,3,7,8 tetrachlorodibenzo paradioxine, which is called as TCDD. Now, this particular compound is usually referred to dioxin and is found in minute compounds as a byproduct when you manufacture hexachlorophene or a herbicide trichlorophenoxyacetic acid, or perhaps they are also produced when you burn garbage, when you combust garbage and industrial waste. And that is why we have seen that the government of India has banned the incinerators which were burning the biological waste from the hospitals, because it leads to production of dioxin. Now, this dioxin is very lethal. Why? Because it is very, very stable. It is very poorly soluble in water. It binds tightly with the soil and its half-life is almost 10 years. That is why you have to be very careful of combusting garbage in the open, which is manufacturing dioxin and which is going to stay for the next decade for all you know. Asbestos is also something which is widely distributed in the environment, and that is because of the industrial pollution. We find that the water pipes have asbestos fibers, and these may become components of food, especially of beverages. So, an additional source of asbestos fibers may be asbestos filtration pads. Now, these are used basically in the water plants where you are actually desalinating the water, or you are filtering the water, or perhaps when you are manufacturing any food commodities. Asbestos is also a chemical hazard which needs to be looked out for. Now, the next important category of man-made contaminants are metallic contaminants. Now, there are a variety of trace metals, as we know, which are present in the environment, as well as we find them in the foods. Some of them in traces are required for good health. For instance, copper is a trace element. In small amounts, it does good to you, but in excess, it can lead to a particular disease. Now, first and the foremost, we are going to look at mercury. This mercury is actually is present in the electrolytic cells. It is made when you produce paper or pulp, in slimicides, in agriculture, etc. Now, mercury is converted, it can be very easily taken care of it if you make the pH alkaline before we dispense this off. There was a disease called as Minamata disease which took place in Japan because mercury was dispensed off in the large water body and there was fish contamination. Lead and tin are also metal contaminants which find way in the food because you have metal cans in which foods are packed. We have soldering of the cans, so that is why we find that it can be lethal if it exceeds the limit of 0.8 milligrams per day. We had recently witnessed the case of Maggi where lead was found in it, and that is why we have to strictly abide by the ADI values which are given by the Food Safety Authority. Cadmium is another metal which comes from burning of coal, fossil fuels, sewage, etc. Some of it finds way in the food, and it can be also through the machinery which is used for processing the food. It is a carcinogen, it is of concern, and that is why we must test the food free of cadmium before it can be dispatched off. Aluminium, although is an alloy, not a heavy metal, but we find that it is coming in the food very often. Our pans, pots, cookware, etc., aluminium foil, everything is made up of aluminium. Some of the food additives also contain aluminium as a salt. It is used in some of the non-dairy creamers, and it is also present in some of the cosmetics. So, there are ample ways by which this particular alloy can find way in the food. It is supposed to be deleterious because it is related today to Alzheimer's disease, dementia, forgetfulness, in simple words. Copper, I have already discussed, is actually a trace element required in small amounts, but when ingested in large or mega doses can lead to Wilson's disease, and it can pose a severe risk to the person who has ingested it. Radioactive fallout has become a major concern. It was always there in the 19th as well as the 20th and the 21st century. When you do nuclear testing, the fallout is on the soil and the water, and it leads to contamination of all that finds way in it. Now, some of the radioactive active isotopes are strontium-90. Now, the problem with this is that it is related to a nutrient which we consume such as calcium. Cesium-137 is related to potassium. So, once it finds its way into our system or through the food it is ingested, it goes and replaces all the calcium which is present in your blood, which is present in your bone, in your skeletal system, and it is replaced by strontium-90. Similarly, potassium is replaced by cesium-137. Now, iodine in that case, which is iodine-131 here, it is a radioactive isotope. It looks like iodine which you consume, so it accumulates in the thyroid gland and their half-life is almost, for iodine it is 8 days, but if you look for cesium 137 it is 30 years, almost 3 decades. For potassium also it is quite high. For strontium 90 it is again 28 years, and this will replace all the calcium in the bone, lead to cancer of bone or leukemias. It can be lethal for children because they take large quantities of calcium in their growing up ages, and that is why the side effects are going to be huge. Now, prevention is simple. Use of ion exchange methods to remove radioisotopes have been developed for emergency measures for decontaminating foods like milk. So finally, let's sum it up. What is the way ahead? We need to develop an effective, integrated national food control system. Strengthening of the surveillance of foodborne diseases in our country is very poor. So monitoring of natural toxicants, environmental contaminants, adulterants, and we must properly use only the permitted additives and follow their guidelines stringently. That means we must use them in the acceptable forms or the maximum permitted limit which has been set by the law agencies. We must not forget that the ancient Indian tradition and culture of food safety has to be kept alive of our country and propagated widely. And lastly, initiate a quality literacy movement to improve the quality of foods which are produced through agriculture or aquaculture. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving us a very, very productive session. I hope that all the students who would be watching us with the help of YouTube would be benefiting from it. Dear friends, very soon we are going to upload this lecture on YouTube for you so that you can access this lecture the number of times you want it, and later on you can give your feedback to us, or if you have any queries, any type of question regarding this particular lecture, you can mail us at info.cc@nic.in. We would love to solve your queries within the lecture itself when Dr. Erim Rao visits us again in the future. Till then, take care, goodbye, and yes, keep writing us. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much.